with respect to the level of regulation by the government, the areas of human behavior utterly and totally dominated by the federal government, much less a state government, the surveillance state, the welfare state, the warfare state, the regulatory state, the administrative state, we are on a downward spiral, and we are losing liberty with every tick of the clock. And unless we get a game changer in the White House and the Congress or on the courts, this spiral will continue. The natural law teaches, this is Aristotle, this is Aquinas, this is Thomas More, this is John Locke, this is Thomas Jefferson, this is Clarence Thomas, to some extent Nino Scalia as well. I mean them no disrespect by calling them by their first names. Argument is that our rights come from our humanity, that my right to think as I wish and speak as I think and publish as I speak, to worship or not to worship, self-defense, privacy, my right to be left alone, are integral to my existence. I have them because I'm a human being. They don't come from the government. That's not an academic argument, because if these rights do come from the government, then the government by ordinary legislation or executive command can restrict those rights. If they come from my humanity, then the Fifth Amendment comes in. The government can only interfere with those rights, life, liberty, or property, with due process, meaning show me what I did wrong, prove it to a neutral jury, let me defend myself and challenge you, and give me the right to appeal.
If we go back to the Kelo decision, which was, what, 2005?
Right.
You know, that was horrible, the Kelo decision, which basically the Supreme Court said, yeah, a state jurisdiction or a state political body can take whatever they want from a private property owner, immediately to turn it over to another private property owner as eminent domain abuse, defined.
Jefferson argued, and I believe, that the only moral, valid, lawful exchange of property is one that is truly voluntary. Hamilton wanted at the Constitutional Convention the same powers that the king did, which is the power to take any property, and the king would decide whether or not he owed you anything. They compromised with the Fifth Amendment, which is the government can take what it wants, but it's got to pay you a fair value for it, and the government has to use it for a public use. Jefferson warned that the public use would be whatever the government wanted its friends to have, and that's where we are. And it's because Jefferson's warnings were disregarded that the government can now take anything.
Forget about what the Supreme Court said in Citizens United. I mean, the fact is that people are now able to express themselves more freely. Do you buy that, and is that enough?
No, I don't buy it.
Okay.
Two FBI agents walk into a library in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and one of them has a self-written search warrant under his arm. I know this sounds like a joke. Two guys walk into a bar, one has a duck under his arm, but it's true. And they serve a self-written, a search warrant, which under the Patriot Act, they wrote for themselves and authorized themselves to the head librarian, saying, we want to know what book so-and-so is taking out. And by the way, you can't tell anybody that we were here. The librarian is 86 years old. The FBI agents are in their early 30s. She says, who the hell are you? She hands the search warrant to her 75-year-old assistant. Fast forward 2 years later, they're in court because they talked about it. The latest trend in free speech violations is compelled speech. There's a sub rosa trend amongst prosecutors now to prosecute people for failing to report crimes that they have witnessed. And I will tell you, under the law, you have no obligation to report anything that you see except treason. There have only been 7 treason prosecutions in 230 years. The same First Amendment, which prohibits the Congress from infringing free speech, prohibits it from compelling speech. So prosecuting someone for not speaking, and then prosecuting someone for speaking truthfully, I got a search warrant from the FBI, what should I do about it, are egregious violations of the First Amendment. The Jim Crow laws compelled the lunch counter owner to segregate by sex, whether the lunch counter owner wanted to do it or not. The evil was the law. The evil was not the person behind the lunch counter. The Southern legislatures lacked the political will to change that. The Southern courts lacked the political and the intellectual will to change it. It was only a nonviolent refusal to obey an unjust law that changed it. That's what I'm talking about. Right. Bring it to today, we'll go back to our friends in the library in Bridgeport. The end of that story is a happy one, by the way, because on the eve of the trial of the, by then, 87-year-old librarian and her 77-year-old assistant, a federal judge said to the U.S. attorneys, I'm about to declare the Patriot Act unconstitutional. Do you still want to go after these two ladies for discussing this warrant? Suddenly the case disappeared. Lately, another sub-rosa trend I'll tell you about. Federal agents serving self-written search warrants on, say, a person who owns a computer store wanting to know who bought a mobile phone or who bought a laptop. They're not complying with it. They're taking it to a lawyer and challenging it. And what are judges doing? Invalidating it. Is that a technical violation of the Patriot Act? Yes, it is. Does it result in a greater freedom? Yes, it does. Is it an example of violating an unjust law without obstructing a governmental function and without causing violence? Yes, it is.
The federal government, before we had a personal income tax, most of their money came from tariffs and excise taxes. Are those moral and income tax immoral, or are both moral? Or
you're home at night and someone knocks on the door and you answer the door and there's a guy with a gun and the guy says, "Give me your money, I want to give it away in your name." Was this guy crazy? You call the police, you find out he's an IRS agent. So that's what taxation is. It is the government extracting money from you against your will to give it away in your name. I'll say this plainly, I've said it before. Taxation is theft. It presumes that the government has a higher claim on our property than we do. When the government imposed excise taxes, that was a user fee. You want to use the government's port. The government owns the water and owns the earth. It shouldn't, but it does. You have to pay for that right. So before the war between the states, the central government existed by user fees. It existed by selling government land. Government still owns, what, 88% of Nevada. That's a lot of land. And it also existed by imposing burdens on the states, financial burdens, for the services the central government performed. That's the way it was intended to be. After the 16th and 17th Amendments, the Senate is no longer representative of the states, and the feds can take a portion of your income tax. The feds take whatever they want. If those two amendments alone were to be repealed, the government would go back to the confines of the Constitution almost overnight. When George W. Bush was elected in 2000, but put aside the manner of his election, I wrote about that and I was critical of the court. And the Republicans took over the Congress. Like a lot of libertarians, I rejoiced because I thought after these years of Bill Clinton, we'll finally get small government. Instead, we got a government that was less faithful to the Constitution than any government since Abraham Lincoln's years, because there's just a Republican version of big government. So when I say a game changer in the White House or the Congress or the courts, I'm talking about someone who is utterly, totally, and without exception, faithful to the values of the primacy of the individual. The government must stay within the confines of the Constitution. What if it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong?